When my parents handed the old house key to my brother and said, "This is yours," I quietly produced the title transfer lawyer note I had filed weeks ago, handed them a 30-day notice, and then watched them scramble to call their attorney. I, 34 stood in the hallway of the house I'd been quietly buying for the past 6 months, watching my parents and younger brother celebrate what they thought was his inheritance. The afternoon light filtered through the dusty windows of the old Victorian that had belonged to my grandmother, and I could feel my pulse steady and calm as my father dangled the brass key in front of my brother's face like it was some kind of trophy. My brother grinned that smug grin I'd seen 1,000 times before, the same one he'd worn when he totaled my first car and convinced our parents it was my fault for lending it to him, the same one when he borrowed $10,000 for his failed restaurant venture and never paid back a cent. He reached for the key, and my mother actually teared up, telling him how proud Grandma would have been to see him taking over the family home. The thing was, Grandma had left the house to all 3 of her grandchildren equally in her will. But my parents had decided, without consulting me, that my brother needed it more. He was struggling, they said. He had vision, they said. He'd do something meaningful with the property, they said. I'd done well enough for myself with my software consulting business, so surely I didn't need my share. They'd called this family meeting 3 weeks ago, insisting I drive the 4 hours from the city to discuss Grandma's estate. I'd known exactly what was coming. My parents had been dropping hints for months, testing the waters, suggesting that maybe I could sign over my portion because family took care of family, and wasn't my brother family too? I'd listened to every word, smiled politely, and said I'd think about it. What I'd actually done was hire a real estate attorney and started making calls. Grandma's estate had been in probate for 8 months. My parents were the executors, and they'd been dragging their feet on the official distribution, probably hoping to wear me down or find some legal loophole that would let them give my brother the whole property. What they didn't know was that probate records were public, and I'd been monitoring every filing. The house needed work. Grandma had lived there for 43 years, and while she'd maintained it beautifully in her younger days, the last decade had seen things decline. The roof leaked, the electrical system was outdated, the plumbing made concerning noises, and the foundation had settling issues. My parents saw a burden. My brother saw a free place to live. I saw an opportunity. I'd contacted my uncle, Grandma's youngest son, who'd inherited a different property and had no interest in this house. I'd offered him cash for his share of the inheritance rights, slightly above market value for a place in this condition. He'd signed within a week. Then I'd approached my cousin, Grandma's other grandchild from her daughter, who lived overseas and wanted nothing to do with property management in the States. Another cash offer, another signature. That gave me controlling interest. But I didn't stop there. I discovered that my parents had taken out a small lien against the property 2 years ago, supposedly for Grandma's medical expenses, though I'd been the one actually paying those bills. They'd borrowed $15,000 and never mentioned it to anyone. The lien holder was a local bank, and I'd quietly paid off the debt and had the lien transferred to my name. Perfectly legal. Perfectly documented. Then I'd filed a petition with the probate court requesting immediate distribution of assets, citing the executor's delays and potential mismanagement. I'd included documentation of the lien, proof of my payments for Grandma's care, and a proposal to buy out the remaining shares at fair market value. The judge had approved it last week. My parents didn't know because they'd stopped checking the probate filings once they thought they had everything arranged. Their attorney had called to inform them, but apparently that message was sitting in my father's voicemail, unchecked. I'd verified that myself through a friend who worked at their lawyer's office. So I stood there, watching this little ceremony, and waited for the perfect moment. My father finished his speech about responsibility and legacy, about how the family home should go to someone who'd appreciate it, someone who needed a fresh start. My brother was nodding along, probably already planning which walls he'd knock down and how quickly he could refinance the place to pull out equity. My mother turned to me then, her expression somewhere between apologetic and defiant. She said she hoped I understood that this was for the good of the family, that surely I could see how much my brother needed this opportunity. She said they'd always be grateful for my sacrifice, and wasn't it wonderful that I was successful enough not to need help? I reached into my messenger bag and pulled out the folder I'd prepared. Inside was the title transfer document, officially recorded with the county 3 days ago. There was the probate court order, signed and sealed. There was the 30-day notice to vacate that I was required to provide to any occupants of my property. And there was a summary sheet I'd prepared, detailing exactly how I'd acquired full ownership legally and properly. I handed the folder to my father without saying a word. He opened it slowly, his face going from confusion to shock to something like anger mixed with disbelief. My mother leaned over his shoulder, and I watched her mouth form a small "oh" as she scanned the first page. My brother asked what was going on, still holding that stupid key, still grinning like he'd won something. My father finally looked up at me, and I could see him trying to process what he was reading. He asked if this was some kind of joke, if I'd really gone behind their backs and stolen the family house. Those were his exact words. Stolen. As if buying out legitimate shares and following every legal requirement was theft. I kept my voice calm and even. I told him I'd purchased the house through proper channels, that every transaction was documented and legal, that the probate court had approved the distribution, and that the property was now solely in my name. I explained that as the legal owner, I was within my rights to determine who could and couldn't occupy the premises, and I'd decided that I wanted possession of my property in 30 days. My mother started crying then, asking how I could do this to family, how I could be so cruel to my own brother. She said Grandma would be ashamed of me, that this wasn't what family did to each other. The irony wasn't lost on me, considering what they'd been trying to do. My brother finally caught on. He threw the key on the floor and started yelling, calling me every name he could think of, saying I'd always been a selfish bastard, that I'd never cared about anyone but myself. He said I didn't need the house, that I was doing this just to spite him, that I was ruining his life on purpose. I let him vent. When he finally ran out of steam, I explained calmly that I'd offered multiple times over the past year to discuss Grandma's estate fairly, that I'd suggested we work together to decide what to do with the property, and that every single time I'd been shut down or ignored. I reminded him that Grandma had wanted the inheritance split equally, and that attempting to cut me out entirely wasn't honoring her wishes, it was spitting on them. My father demanded to know how much I'd paid for the other shares. I told him. He went pale. The total was less than the house's value, but not by much, and he realized immediately that I'd leveraged every advantage I had. He asked about the lien, and I explained exactly how I discovered it and why I'd paid it off. I mentioned that I'd also reviewed all the executor expenses they'd claimed, and I'd found several irregularities that I'd be happy to discuss with the probate court if necessary. That stopped him cold. See, they'd been billing the estate for mileage and administrative costs that seemed inflated. Nothing technically illegal, but enough to raise questions if someone looked closely. They'd been treating the executor role as a part-time job with benefits. My mother tried a different approach. She softened her voice and told me we could work this out as a family, that surely there was a compromise somewhere. She suggested maybe my brother could rent the property from me, or we could co-own it, or perhaps I could sell him my share at a reduced price. I shook my head. I told her the time for compromise had been 6 months ago, or 3 months ago, or even 3 weeks ago when they'd called this meeting. The time for working together as family had been before they decided to exclude me entirely. I said I'd given them every opportunity to do this right, and they'd chosen this path, not me. My father grabbed his phone and said he was calling their attorney right now, that there had to be something illegal about what I'd done, some way to reverse it. I encouraged him to make the call. I told him I'd be happy to provide my attorney's contact information so they could talk directly. I mentioned that I'd documented every conversation we'd had about the estate, every text message, every email where they'd pressured me to give up my inheritance. He made the call. I could hear the attorney's voice through the phone, though not the words. My father's face went from angry to confused to defeated over the course of about 5 minutes. When he hung up, he just stood there, staring at the folder like it might suddenly change. The attorney had confirmed what I'd told them. Everything was legal. Everything was proper. The probate court had approved the distribution. The title was transferred. The 30-day notice was valid. There was nothing to contest unless they wanted to waste money on a lawsuit they'd definitely lose. My brother slumped into Grandma's old armchair, the one she'd always sat in while reading. He looked genuinely lost, and for a moment I almost felt bad. Almost. Then I remembered the car, and the money, and the dozens of other times he'd taken advantage of family generosity without a second thought. I remembered how he'd laughed when I'd asked for the loan repayment, telling me I was being petty about money. My mother tried once more. She asked what I planned to do with the house, whether I was going to live in it or sell it. She said surely I didn't need it, that my apartment in the city was nice, that I had a good life. I told her my plans were my own business, but since she asked, I was considering several options. I might renovate and rent it out. I might sell it and invest the proceeds. I might even move in myself, since I'd been thinking about leaving the city anyway. What I definitely wouldn't be doing was giving it away to someone who'd never appreciated what they had. My father asked about the 30 days, whether I was serious about that. I confirmed that I was. I explained that the house needed significant work, and I'd already hired contractors to assess the situation. They'd need access to start planning repairs, and I couldn't have that with occupants in the way. I mentioned that legally, since they'd never established a formal rental agreement or paid rent to the estate, they were technically squatters as of the moment the title transferred. That was harsh, but it was true. They'd been living in the house, temporarily for the past 8 months, supposedly maintaining it while the estate was settled. In reality, they'd been treating it as their own property, making decisions and promises about its future without legal authority. My brother suddenly stood up and got in my face. He asked if I really hated him this much, if family meant so little to me. He was shaking with anger, and I could smell beer on his breath even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. I stepped back and met his eyes. I told him I didn't hate him at all, that this wasn't about emotion, it was about fairness and respect. I said I'd spent my whole life watching him get bailed out, watching him take advantage, watching him face 0 consequences for his actions. I told him Grandma had loved all of us equally, and she'd wanted us all to benefit equally, and I was simply ensuring her wishes were honored the way they should have been from the start. He swung at me. I'd half expected it, and I moved enough that his fist mostly caught my shoulder instead of my face. My father grabbed him from behind, pulling him back, telling him to calm down. My mother just stood there, tears streaming down her face, looking between all of us like she couldn't understand how this had happened. I picked up my folder and told them they had 30 days starting from the date on the notice. I said I'd be conducting a walkthrough inspection in 1 week to document the property's condition, and I expected full cooperation. I mentioned that any damage beyond normal wear and tear would be billed to them personally. Then I turned and walked out. Behind me, I could hear my mother calling my name, my father trying to console my brother, and someone kicking furniture. I got in my car, drove to the end of the street, and parked. My hands were shaking, not from fear or anger, but from adrenaline. I'd just burned every bridge with my immediate family in the span of 15 minutes. My phone started ringing within minutes. First my mother, then my father, then my brother, then my mother again. I didn't answer. I'd said everything I needed to say. Update 1. The next week was chaos. My parents left voicemails ranging from tearful pleas to angry threats. My brother sent text messages calling me every name imaginable. Extended family members I hadn't heard from in years suddenly reached out, having heard one-sided versions of the story, telling me I was tearing the family apart. I documented everything. Every message, every call, every contact. My attorney advised me to keep records in case things escalated. The walkthrough inspection came. My parents had hired their own attorney by then, a bulldog of a woman who showed up with them, ready for a fight. She reviewed all my documentation, asked pointed questions, and then quietly advised my parents that they had no legal standing. She suggested they negotiate terms for moving out rather than resist. The house was in worse shape than I'd thought. My parents had been living there rent-free but hadn't maintained anything. The leak in the roof had caused water damage to the second-floor ceiling. The electrical panel was a fire hazard. They'd even started removing some of Grandma's built-in cabinets, probably planning to renovate before I'd intervened. I documented everything with photos and video. My parents watched silently, their new attorney taking her own notes. When I pointed out the damage, my father tried to argue that it was pre-existing, but I pulled out the estate inventory from 8 months ago, showing the house in much better condition. Their attorney asked if I'd consider a settlement. Maybe they could buy the property back, or buy me out, or arrange some kind of payment plan. I asked if they had the funds. Silence. They'd already spent most of their savings on my brother's failed business ventures. I told them the 30 days stood, no extensions. They could take whatever personal belongings they wanted, but anything attached to the house stayed. I'd be changing the locks on day 31, and anything left behind would be disposed of. Update 2. Day 28 arrived. My parents had been scrambling, trying to find somewhere to go. My brother had disappeared, apparently staying with friends and avoiding the whole situation. My mother called me one last time, her voice small and tired. She said she understood now that they'd been wrong. She said she'd let my father and brother convince her that cutting me out was justified because I was successful and didn't need help. She said she'd been thinking about Grandma a lot, about what she would have wanted, and she realized they'd dishonored her memory by trying to manipulate her will. She didn't ask for forgiveness or an extension. She just said she was sorry, and she hoped someday I could understand why they'd done it, even if it was wrong. Then she hung up. I sat with that call for a long time. Part of me wanted to give in, to offer them more time or work out some arrangement. But I knew that would just reset everything back to the old pattern. They'd take advantage, my brother would find some new scheme, and nothing would change. On day 30, I showed up at the house with a moving truck and a locksmith. My parents were already gone. They'd left the place mostly clean, though they'd taken some things that were arguably part of the estate. Grandma's dining table, some antique lamps, a few pieces of artwork. I let it go. Picking those battles wasn't worth it. The locksmith changed all the locks while I did a final walkthrough. The house felt empty and sad, full of memories that now felt tainted by everything that had happened. I stood in Grandma's bedroom, looking out the window at the oak tree she'd loved, and wondered if I'd done the right thing. Then I remembered the key dangling in my brother's face, the smug grin, my mother's tears that were only for him, never for me, and I knew I had. This wasn't about revenge, really. It was about boundaries and consequences and refusing to be erased from my own family history. Update 3. 6 months later, I'd fully renovated the house. The roof was fixed, the electrical system upgraded, the plumbing replaced. I'd kept as much of Grandma's original character as possible while modernizing what needed modernizing. The place was beautiful, and I'd decided to keep it as a rental property with an excellent management company handling day-to-day operations. My parents never spoke to me again. I'd see occasional social media posts from relatives showing family gatherings I wasn't invited to. My brother had moved 2 states away, apparently working construction. Extended family had mostly chosen sides, and I'd lost that coin flip. But I'd gained something too. Peace, maybe. The knowledge that I'd stood up for myself and refused to be pushed aside. The understanding that sometimes being family isn't enough if there's no respect underneath it. On Grandma's birthday, I visited her grave alone. I told her about the house, about what I'd done, about how the family had fractured. I told her I hoped she'd understand, that I tried to honor her wishes the best way I knew how. The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, and I chose to believe that was her answer. She'd always been practical, always fair, always insisted that people earn what they received. She would have hated what my parents tried to do. At least, that's what I told myself. I drove back to the city that evening, my phone silent, my conscience clear enough. The house stood behind me, restored and renewed, waiting for its next chapter. Maybe someday my family would come around. Maybe they wouldn't. Either way, I'd learned an important lesson about who I was willing to be. Sometimes revenge isn't about hurting someone. Sometimes it's just about refusing to be hurt yourself. The key, the title transfer, the 30-day notice, none of it had been about making them suffer. It had been about drawing a line and saying this far, no further. This much of me exists, and you can't pretend otherwise. That was enough. It had to be. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us.